Welcome everybody to our JDS Communications webinar. And the title of the webinar is Graphical Abstracts to Enhance Your Paper's Visibility. And today I will be presenting first, but then I've asked two sort of very savvy graphical abstract people to speak. The first being Catherine Bach from Cornell University, and the second, Pam Ruig from Michigan State. So I wanted, before we start talking about graphical abstracts, I just want to talk a little bit about the birth of JDS Communications and where it came from and sort of our philosophy. The first issue and volume were published in August 2020. And JDS Communications essentially is a sister journal to the Journal of Dairy Science. And what we decided to do was to move all the short communications and technical notes out of the Journal of Dairy Science and into JDS Communications. But in addition to these two paper types, which were traditionally found in the Journal of Dairy Science, we also allowed the submission of mini reviews, and these mini reviews do not require an invitation. And we are also moving all the symposia reviews from the annual meeting into the JDS Communications. So our hope is that this journal is going to grow by the addition of these different paper types, but also we want it to grow just because we'd like to see more of your sort of focused research projects that maybe are answer a very specific question, maybe not totally appropriate for the Journal of Dairy Science. And we're really interested in those types of papers for JDS Communications. Now, JDS Communications does differ somewhat from JDS. And I think the first thing that's different is we do have page and figure table limits. And when you write a paper for Journal of Dairy Science, of course, it can be as long as you want. You can include as many figures and tables as you would like. But for JDS Communications, we only allow 5 printed pages, and this works out to about 5,000 words, or better yet, check the number of keystrokes, start to finish, about 30,000 keystrokes. We also only allow 3 tables and figures in any combination. So for example, 2 tables, 1 figure, or 1 table, 2 figures, a total of 3. And of course, that can really constrain people, but remember, if you have a project that is a little more complicated, you can always create figures with multiple panels. But the bottom line is it's figure 1, 2, and 3, not 4, 5, and 6. We do allow data supplements, but the data supplements can only include raw unprocessed data sets, videos, or code. We don't want you to create data supplements for all your extra tables and figures. That's not allowed. So, and we don't specifically host the data supplement. We would like you to host it on a third-party location. And that's all detailed in our instructions to authors. We publish every other month for JDS Communications, and open access fee of approximately $775. And perhaps the reason for this webinar today is we require a cover page with a graphical abstract, and we're going to be talking more about that today. Now, we are similar to JDS in a lot of ways, and so, for example, the journal management team is exactly the same, Susan Pollock and Shauna Miller. The technical editor team is exactly the same. Same people handle JDS articles as JDSC articles. What we've gone to is we basically pull, for lack of a better term, retired JDS editors into JDSC. So I'm handling physiology, Pam handles health, behavior, and well-being, John Rose handles nutrition, farm systems, Jenny Price got genetics, and Marianne Drake handles dairy food. So we have very experienced section editors, and our editorial board and reviewers are also very experienced. So where we are now, this is an infographic that Susan Pollock put together along with Louise Adam. And basically in 2021, we published 82 articles. You can see that the majority of our submissions are from the United States and Canada, but we also have submissions from Europe and other parts of the world. And our papers are sort of generally distributed equally across all the different sections, the foods, genetics, and the health, and physiology, and animal nutrition. We want to try to, one of our goals is to have a very short time from short review time shorter review time and a shorter time to publication. And this in part is made possible because it's just basically a shorter paper. And so reviewers are more likely to accept a review accept to work on a JDSC paper because they know it's not it's a shorter paper. It's going to be easier to review because there's just simply less content to go through. I want to call everybody's attention to our very first special issue, and a special issue is an opportunity to kind of collect papers around a specific topic. And our first special issues, of course, I'm a dairy fertility guy, so advances in dairy cow fertility. And so basically we're calling for those of you who have papers, short communications, technical notes, etc., reviews that have to do with dairy cow fertility to submit your papers by June 15th, and we'll put those all together in one issue, and it'll sort of be a nice collection of communications around the same topic. Now we have 25 page fee waivers for open access. So if we get 25 published papers, everyone will receive a waiver of that $775 charge. And so our goal is to get to 25 papers within the special issue. If we exceed that, then the waivers will obviously go to younger authors or authors who have a financial need to publish with us. But we do have the first 25. We have a fee waivers for those publications going into this special issue. So I want to talk about the graphical abstracts and sort of where the concept came from. And in my reading, I always enjoyed, I enjoy reading Cell, which is another Elsevier journal. And I always enjoyed the fact that in the journal Cell, that they had this kind of graphical abstract page. And on this graphical abstract, they sort of a pictorial version of the paper. And they also have the title and the authors, and they have this in brief, which is a summary and then highlights of the paper. And I always thought that was a great idea. So I challenged, when we developed Journal of Dairy Science, JDS Communications, it allowed us to maybe do some things a little differently than JDS. So I challenged Susan and Louise to come up with a similar page for us, and they came up with this page, which isn't exactly the same as Cell, but it has all the same parts. In other words, the title is there and the authors and a graphical abstract in the center here, and summary and highlights. And this is, we launched this when we launched the journal. So I'd like to say a few words about the graphical abstract page. First of all, this is the front page to your paper. It's not really page one. It's the page that comes before page one, maybe a preamble or something like that. It does contain the journal name, the DOI, the year and the volume and the pages. It contains the title, all of the authors. The graphical abstract, which we're going to be talking about today, is in the center. And then it also includes your summary and your highlights. So one of the things to remember is your graphical abstract doesn't necessarily have to say it all, because it's going to be nested within this graphical abstract page. Now, the first page of your article looks just like you'd expect it to, just like any first page of a scientific article. So this is page one, essentially showing, the title, the authors, the abstract, and then the introduction, and et cetera. So graphical abstract page sort of sits ahead and is meant to be a standalone page. So for help with graphical abstracts, we've got a couple of experts here. We're going to talk about it with you, but with help with graphical abstracts, we do in our instructions for authors, we do provide some links to some information by Elsevier puts out how to produce a good visual graphical abstract. And they also have some recommendations for your highlights. So Elsevier does have some content online that can help you. And in addition to that, so you always can go there to have a look. So before I conclude with my introductory comments, I just want to make one sort of final comment. And that is, you can do as much or as little as you want in terms of your graphical abstract. We have some authors who simply take one of the figures from their paper and use that as their graphical abstract. And there are no graphical abstract police out there, okay? No one's gonna reject your paper because we didn't like your graphical abstract. This isn't really part of the review process. So you are welcome, like this is one of my papers, and I had the option with my paper to simply put one of my figures into the graphical abstract and use that. But I went with the alternative approach was just to develop the challenge of sort of developing a graphical abstract. And I actually kind of enjoyed it because it was, I don't know, it was this interesting process to think, okay, how can I depict what I did on a single diagram or a single figure that might convey something to a reader. And so I took on that challenge. And you're not going to notice a lot of color here because I'm colorblind. And so I go with pretty simple colors. But basically what I did was I said, well, all right, I want to depict sort of a little bit about the cows we had in the experiment. In this experiment, we had two groups of cows calving early in the calving season, others calving late in the calving season. And then I wanted to depict something about the breeding programs we tested, either a control or a sync and resync program. And then I wanted to just sort of depict something about the results. And so it was essentially what I did to create my graphical abstract. And so I found it kind of I found it a very rewarding sort of thing to do. So now I've asked two different people to talk, one Catherine Bach and the other Pam Ruig. And if you just allow us a second, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to ask Catherine to go ahead and start sharing. And Catherine is going to discuss sort of her approach to creating her recent graphical abstract. Catherine, I'm going to stop sharing now.
Okay. Everything's showing up okay?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for having me come and talk a little bit about graphical abstracts. I won't admit to being an expert at all. I just like talking science. And so hopefully I can give you all just a little hint about where I come from when it comes to jumping in and doing a graphical abstract. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking a little bit about how I go about these things. And I start with this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think we all know that and have heard that adage many, many times. And I put up a picture here of, if any of you have made IKEA furniture, you probably know that there are absolutely no words in IKEA furniture, and all of it is done in pictures. But you can look at these pictures and figure out quite a bit, like, hey, I don't know what's going on. Let's call IKEA. But of course, that has nothing to do with our scientific papers, but just a reminder that there's so much that can be said without actually even needing words. So what is my plan of attack when I think about my graphical abstract? The thing I really go back to is my research question, because especially with JDS Communications, these are generally shorter papers. They may not have as many objectives and things like that. That question itself, what's that main story that I'm trying to tell, is a really good place to start. And so so the paper I'm going to show my abstract for is one that was published in JDS Communications about blood calcium as a prognostic indicator for success after surgical correction of left displaced abomasum. And my research question was literally, is blood total calcium concentration at the time of LDA surgical correction associated with milk yield or herd removal 60 days after correction? And so my plan of attack was to think about the context, the methods, and the conclusions of my paper. And like I said, if you go back to that question, so for my question was is the blood total calcium at the time of LDA correction, you can think the context here is really, I was looking at blood total calcium at time of LDA correction. That's my context. That's the beginning of my story. My methods are super simple. And I mean, could be more complicated for your paper, but I followed these cows for 60 days after their DA surgery. And so the methods don't have to be every single piece of information that's happened. That's what the methods section is for. But you want to lay out what the most important part of the story is. So my question, what did I do? And then you fill in the conclusions from there. So the example for my abstract that I did was I had my cows. They were less than 30 days in milk, a little bit of information about where they came from. They were all cows who had LDA surgeries. And I looked at total calcium. And then I followed them up for 8 weeks. And I looked at milk yield and herd removal. And so this just is a snapshot of what I found. I chose to add additionally another little highlight here because there wasn't enough evidence to show any association between total calcium at time of LDA surgery and milk yield or herd removal. However, it was really fascinating to look at the calcium concentrations of these cows. And so I added that to the abstract as well, which also allowed me to kind of comment on that in my highlights and things like that. So it gives you just another way to allow people to draw some conclusions from your paper and illustrate those conclusions. And that's what I found to be kind of the most beneficial part of the graphical abstract. And I think it's like Matt said, it's a really nice challenge to see how can I take this information that's in a 5-page paper and put it in a snapshot that answers so many questions about what you wrote.
Excellent. Okay, now we're going to, I would encourage everyone to perhaps, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll handle those questions. If you have questions, put those questions in the Q&A. And then we will go ahead and handle those questions at the end. And so now, so thank you very much, Catherine. Appreciate that. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful abstract. And I've also asked Pam Ruig to speak. So Pam, we're gonna let you go ahead and share your screen and show us.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, I didn't make a PowerPoint. I'm going to speak a little bit more about kind of the process and some of the things I did right and some of the things I did wrong. But I'm going to start with saying that when I wrote this paper, I intended to submit it to JDS Communications. It's perfect as a short communication because it's just a blood prevalence study of 3 different organisms in 2 different states on 84 different farms. Okay, so I want to repeat that. I designed this study, or I wrote the study to go in JDS Com, and then I'm reading, it's my first submission to JDS Com, even though I'm an editor, etc. And I'm thinking, as I'm getting ready, I gotta make that stupid graphical abstract. And I was amazingly annoyed. I mean, as somebody, when you submit papers, you know, you go through all these steps, you jump through all the hoops, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that graphical abstract. And I decided this particular study didn't have a graduate student. We had actually an undergraduate student working on it, but it was a project that was an exploratory project from USDA. And I could have assigned it to that undergraduate student, but I had never made a graphical abstract. And I don't like to assign other people stuff to do if I've never done it, because I have no idea if it's going to be easy or it's going to be hard. So I decided to do it myself. So I was super annoyed. I had never made a graphical abstract. I wouldn't consider myself overly like artistic in this way or conceptual. And I had data from 2 states, 3 organisms, and 2 techniques. And I'm like, how am I going to get this data boiled down in a usable way in something that actually looks good? And I'll also say I was intimidated. So I kind of did what Catherine said. I initially went back to the same thing we all ask our graduate students or whatever. What's the question? And what was the main thing I learned, and how can I communicate that? And really the story on this was we found this organism everywhere. All of the organisms on basically all of the farms. And I wanted to convey kind of the high prevalence and the fact that we had a study from multiple animals on multiple farms. So I went back to thinking about it, and I told Matt yesterday when we were talking about what we're going to present a little bit today. I said, I started off super annoyed on making this thing, and then I spent basically a whole day enjoying making the graphical abstract. And at the end of the day, I was pretty happy with it. I felt like it conveyed the subject, and you can see it here. There's things I'll change, which I'll briefly talk about in a minute. But I think if you take a look at this graphical abstract, I found a little icon up here that showed that we had some samples. I decided, the two states are different colored barns. And if you look carefully on those barns, you can count up how many farms we had there and how they're distributed among states. And then the little groups were the 3 different organisms we had. And I think it's pretty evident that if you see the red versus black cows, they're different. So that translated into the prevalence for each of those organisms. So, I think at the end of the day, if what I learned in doing this is if I once I sat back and thought about what I was doing, A, I really enjoyed it. B, I think it's a good way to communicate science. Now, what would I do differently? I didn't really realize that this graphical abstract was going to have the summary and the highlights. And that whole sentence on the front, where top of my abstract, where I had text, blood samples were collected from 1,930 cows, blah, 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 is replicated in the highlights. Didn't need it. So, if I was going to do this again, I'd write my summary and my highlight first, and then I'd go in and make the abstract, not trying to duplicate those, what I've already got in the text. So I think I would change that. The other thing I think that I was pretty happy that I didn't do. So if you look at that cell graphical abstract that Matt presented first, I found that super intimidating because the graphics are so phenomenal. And we can all go to BioRender and pull out some of those graphics, but I didn't want to go to BioRender and learn a whole new system. And I have gone to BioRender and looked around there, but I didn't find it intuitive. I made my graphical abstract in a single slide in PowerPoint because I know how to make PowerPoint slides. And I used the graphics that I always use, that graphical library that comes with PowerPoint or on the internet. So I tried to make the actual process of creating it something I already knew how to do. And the hard creative part was really trying to put the concepts together. Right. So with that, that's all I got.
All right, fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Pam. And that was really excellent. I'm just trying to see if we have any questions for us, and we don't have any questions. So I might just do some summaries or discussions here. So first of all, at this point, and Susan may or may not wish to weigh in at this point, but I feel like at this point, in terms of the Journal of Dairy Science, we are not fully there yet in terms of the requirement for a graphical abstract, but I think they're optional at this point. And Susan hopefully will correct me somehow if I'm incorrect. But anyways, I think they're optional at this point. And so JDS Communications is different with respect to the fact that we do this cover page and we require this graphical abstract. And so I guess I would ask, and the second thing I would say is sort of reiterate that what PM said is when I did mine, I also just did it in PowerPoint because I was familiar with PowerPoint, but there are other ways to do this. And I'm gonna just ask Catherine very quickly. Catherine, did you use PowerPoint or you use something else for yours?
For mine, I used PowerPoint because, again, kind of like Pam, it was like, I know this, it's quick, it's new, I'll use this. But there are some other places online. BioRender is one option. Another is a free program called Canva, C-A-N-V-A. Canva has quite a few graphics that are free to use, and they also even have some templates, which is kind of nice. And so that's another option for getting some free graphics.
Mhm.
The other places, and I think there was actually a Q&A question, Susan, I was looking, well, I saw that was about, are there other places online to find some graphics and things like that? There are, if you go to the Elsevier Graphical Abstract instructions, they do have 2 sites listed there that have free, just basically clip art you can download. Not all of them are free, some of them are and some aren't, but there are quite a few sites like that on the internet that you can find. And that way you don't have to worry about any copyright type infringements, etc.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Catherine. And I had a question here. How much, I'll handle this one and then maybe I kick it over to the other people. How much of your results graphs do you recommend including in Graphical Abstracts? Do we just put the most important points or try to hold some information back for the rest of the paper, which is an excellent question. I mean, how dense do you want to make your graphical abstract? So I'm gonna like first say that please stay within the conclusions that you made in your paper. In other words, for example, we don't police these really closely. Actually, I do look at them, but we don't. Please don't all of a sudden come out with information in your graphical abstract it's not supported by what's inside your paper or not supported in your statistical analyses of your data. Okay, so just because you want it to be this way, this isn't your opportunity to stick it in there. Okay, so stay inside the lines. And then that's a really great question. And so I'm gonna kick it to Pam because Pam's a faster thinker than I am. How much do you think you need to include, or how would you approach that, Pam?
I struggle with that because we had really in this particular paper, we had some really interesting parity effects that differed between the bovine leukemia virus and the hemotrophic mycoplasmas. And it's actually a really interesting finding. And I decided just to leave it out. Because there just wasn't enough space. And I think you really got to pare it down to what's the most important message in the abstract, because you just can't make these things too complex. It's too hard to understand. It's like the IKEA instructions.
Right. Yeah. So the fantastic. Hey, Catherine, I had a question here. What about, we talked about this yesterday a little bit, use of photographs in a graphical abstract. What do you, I think you talked about, I was thinking about a photograph, but I didn't go with the photographs. What do you think about, so the short answer is we do have some authors who include photographs in their graphical abstract. Do you have any thoughts about a photo versus other alternative illustration?
I think with illustrations, you can get a lot more across sometimes than a photograph. However, I do understand, say, if you are using a specific plate or something to plate, a bacteria, you may want to show that in the graphical abstract, and then a picture is something that would be helpful. The only thing that can be complicating with pictures, in order to make them large enough to be meaningful, sometimes you need to take up the entire graphical abstract, because think about where it would be on a sheet of paper. It's going to be like a 5x7 piece of, it'd be a 4x6 or 5x7 photograph. So if you're only taking up a third of that, it's hard to see. And then you also need to probably use your own photograph or something that has no license to it, because those are more difficult to keep under the copyright type stuff, I know.
Yeah. Hey, yes, that excellent comment. Hey, Pam, I got one for you. You ready? Okay, JDS Communications, you only got 5 pages, right? How are you going to handle your references? What is your strategy to handle your references and not letting your references get out of sight in terms of numbers? Do you have any ways you approach a reference list?
Yeah, I just cite myself continuously. No. That limits it, you know?
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. But you know, in general in JDS, you're not supposed to use more than 3 references for any concept, which is self-limiting in yourself. And I think with the limited number of pages, you've just got to be really judicious in your citation list.
It's really frustrating because I think we all respect good work, and we hate to leave some authors off our reference list, but inevitably it can happen simply because we have limited space. It's interesting, isn't it?
Can I make a quick little other comment?
Yeah.
I think it's actually, in a lot of ways, now having reviewed for a few years now, being a reviewer, I think it's actually a really good practice for people to realize that you don't need to have a gigantic introduction with a ton of references to get across the really important points that you need to get across. And I think people sometimes, that's what I kind of love about JDS Communications. It's an activity in how can you do the best work you can without getting carried away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point that Catherine brings up. And one of the things that I've always thought about was the fact that when we submit grant applications to the USDA or to NIH or NSF, there's always page limits. There's always a page limit. And so that's one thing. And so there are situations where we're constrained in our writing. And the second thing I often think about, I love to read old Journal of Dairy Science articles, and they used to be quite short, actually. Historically, Journal of Dairy Science articles are far less than, 5 pages would be a lot, and so, and this, one of the things we're trying to do with JDS Communications is just sort of constrain this. And I applaud Catherine for saying that, because that is one situation where we get these massive introductions that, start out in the history of time, the cow was born, I don't know, Noah loaded the cow on the ark, and then we go from there, right? So so it is helpful to really consolidate that information, and it really is. How many references should I cite? How many is too many? I don't think we have any specific number, but you certainly probably don't want to fill up 25% of your paper with a reference list, I think. So that's really, really true. One of the questions they had was if you were doing a mini review, like now you're doing a review paper. Now this one's really hard, so I'm going to shoot it to Pam. Okay, if you were doing a review paper, any thoughts on a graphical abstract for a review paper? Because so now you don't necessarily have any data. That's you might be not presenting data. That's a really hard one.
It is. I've been reading that question and thinking about the answer to that, actually. I wrote a mini review this year for another journal. And, I think it's challenging in the first place to write mini reviews, because by the nature of a review, you're looking at something comprehensive. So I don't know the right answer to this, but what I would say is when you write a mini review, you usually have to decide on what's like your 3 biggest concepts that you're trying to get across. And I think the graphical abstract would be something of funneling down some ideas into concepts. So, if you were doing reviews on the impact of mastitis on, let's say, fertility, you'd probably have some pictures of inflammation, CLs being lysed to make some conclusion about that statement. But I think it'd be maybe a 2-day project to make a graphical abstract for mini review, because you'd really have to think about maybe the top 2 or 3 concepts that are coming out of the review.
Yeah, it's a good point. Did you want to add anything to that, Catherine? Do you have any thoughts about that? If you had to do a review for a graphical abstract?
I think Pam has the absolute right idea there. Like, what are your main big takeaways and how do they connect?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, you can't, because if you try to put too much in, it just gets too busy. Yeah.
So I had another question here. Another question is the line spacing in the manuscript for JDS Communications. So obviously the submission, the way you submit a JDS Communications, it's format neutral. And what that means is we can handle a variety of formats, but obviously we need line numbers, and we need, it's got to be written sequentially, but we don't necessarily have section headings and things like that. But it is format neutral, which means you have, we can handle a lot of different types of submissions and then format them into the style and form that we want. But the question is, I think the other part of this question is, how do we, when we go to typeset, can we do things to make sure that it fits into 5 pages? We can do some things to help it fit into 5 pages. But in the end, as an author, you need to think about, to some extent, the shape of your figures. Will they fit in one column, for example? If you're going to have a figure, will it fit into one column? If you have a panel, is it going to take up a whole page or not? You need to think a little bit about the shape of your figures and the shape of your tables to help us a little bit. So our technical editors will work to try to make sure it fits into the 5 pages, but we also need some help from authors not to exceed the word and character limits. So we've really pushed this down pretty tight.
Matt, can I just say, the way I read that question, I think that it's just important to reiterate that the word limit is what matters, not the number of pages you use up. The word limit is 5,000, and I think it's 5,000. And so, yeah, there we go. Susan's answered that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So 5,000 words, right? And what I'll do as an editor, just so everybody knows, is when your paper comes in, we're still playing with some things. We've always traditionally not had a lot of pre-editing going on. In other words, for some journals, you might submit and somebody who's not an editor might kick your paper back to you right away because it doesn't fit some criteria. I don't think we're generally doing that for JDS Communications. So as an editor, what I'll do is when paper comes in, I will very quickly look at it. If it looks way out of bounds, just based on the number of pages there, I will, if it's way out of bounds, I, as the editor, probably going to kick it back to you. If it comes back from revision and it's out of bounds, at some point we have to address the fact that this paper is too long. Okay, so it's not unusual for us to get maybe 6,000 words or 35,000 characters, and I know it's not going to fit. And at some point during the review process, you're going to get an email that says, "Hey, you got to cut some stuff out of here," and you're going to tell me, "Hey, the reviewer is asking for it." And I'm sensitive to that, but we've got to get it down to this 5 pages. We don't want JDS Communications to turn into 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages. Okay, there's contract implications to that, and there's a lot of implications while we're trying to get these things under 5 pages. So, and somebody will probably write me and say, "Hey, I saw a JDSC paper that was 7 pages. I know it's a process, but we're working towards 5. Okay, we're working towards 5. Okay, and good. So, what other questions do we have here? These are excellent questions. So I had a question here, just as a review, the guiding principles. So, Catherine, as a review, your guiding principles. I'm really putting a lot of pressure on you, Catherine, but you're younger, okay? So
that's perfectly fine. I'm allowed to. I'm perfectly fine. I always like to think about my guiding, like my research question is my big guiding principle, because that really was what guided the entire story of that paper.
Mhm.
And then think about the context. That's very important. So I like to think of my graphical abstract as something that tells the context, maybe a little bit about the methods, and then some type of conclusion that is a really good takeaway from the paper. And so the idea being that that tells the whole story of the paper in just a little snapshot. Of course, you're not going to be able to put all the methods. You're going to put the ones that are important. Same with the context. You're not going to put all the context about it, but what's important context, that if somebody didn't know that, it would change their thought of your conclusions or things
Yeah.
like that. So that's how I kind of go about it. Of course, if it's a different type of paper, maybe it's going to focus more on the context and the methods.
Mhm.
Or maybe it's going to focus more on, if you have some really huge conclusions, maybe you don't need to put a lot of context or methods in it and focus more on some of the conclusions in the graphical abstract. But at least if you start with that framework, I think you'll have something that's helpful for the reader.
Right. So we had another question. I'm going to keep going, Catherine. We had another question about what programs you use. And Pam and I both use PowerPoint. And then when I did mine, I did use PowerPoint, and then I just saved the figure as a JPEG or something. I don't know, the whole thing. I didn't actually send a PowerPoint slide. I think I just saved it as a JPEG or whatever. But then, Catherine, you mentioned, what was the other name of the program you used or you find useful?
Well, I've used Canva, Canva. They have a free version and a pro version if you want to pay for more images, but that has a lot of icons and kind of template type things. BioRender also works, but I kind of agree with Pam. It's a little bit of a learning curve, and why do I want to spend the time learning that? Also, you'll find that especially for molecular things, everybody's looks exactly the same. With BioRender, where you might have some more creative flexibility in some of the other programs. And then I had mentioned before using some of the icon downloads there's the examples on the Elsevier Graphical Abstract website. The instructions, had some websites that you can use to get some at least some clip art type pictures.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the last question, and then I'm going to wrap up the presentations. There was a question about can you suggest the names of people to review or not review the manuscript, and the answer is yes. And so essentially when we do manuscript reviews, we use ScholarOne, and we use ScholarOne for JDS, we use ScholarOne for JDSC. It's essentially the same process we use, and during that process you are more than welcome to suggest reviewers as well as of individuals you prefer not review your paper. We recommend to section editors that they honor those requests. So there's always the potential for some. In general, we honor those requests, and in general, we will often, it's not a rule, but we will often use at least one recommended reviewer, okay, providing it's appropriate, okay. So please, and they can be very helpful. So I think we've pretty much covered all the questions, and this webinar is recorded, and it's going to go onto the ADSA site, and we will attempt to answer any remaining questions as they come that perhaps did not get answered. I want to, it will be recorded. I want to thank very much my two experts, Dr. Pam Rugg and Dr. Catherine Bach, for their help with this. And I certainly would hope that you listeners would consider submitting your papers to JDS Communications. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.